Okay, we are back. So we talked about basically how a bill becomes a law. There are other functions or related functions of the legislature, but other functions that they perform. The budgetary function is one of the most important. The budget is determining how much money the federal government has, how much money the federal government gets to spend. And it's one of the most basic and important powers that the Congress has. The power of the purse, the power to determine spending. Originally, it was made for funding, but after the Great Depression, as we saw the federal government grow, we talked about this when we talked about the expansion of federalism, the change into modern cooperative federalism. As we saw the federal government grow and become more important, it became more and more of a policy tool. Basically determining where the money goes determines how much attention is given to an issue. For example, let's say that Congress passes a law saying that we are going to get rid of homelessness in our country, and they fund it with $1 trillion. Well, how many houses are going to get built for $1 trillion? Quite a few. That's a pretty good bill. What happens if they say we're going to address homelessness, but they cut spending on the bill to $1? Nothing's going to get done, right? So by controlling that budget, they can really control what happens. One of the most important things, 1974, the Congressional Budget Act was passed, making the Congressional Budget Office now technically the president through the Office of Management and Budget. The president really was traditionally responsible for sort of setting up the budget, even though Congress passed it, because the president, as the chief executive, he oversaw what the government did, and so it was his job to say how much it's going to cost. But in 1974, Congress said, we don't really think we can trust the president to be impartial on the information he's giving us. So they created the Congressional Budget Office, a way to take back power to the Congress and to say, we're going to have our own nonpartisan agency to help us figure out how much this can cost. They also look at things when a new bill comes out. One of the things you can do if you're interested in it is you look at the CBO score, and they'll talk about how effective they think the bill might be. Is it going to be able to achieve its goals at the current funding level? So the budget is very important. Unfortunately, it's also very contentious because spending money is kind of a big deal. It's one of the biggest things they do. And so while we want a budget every year, the reality is we rarely get a budget. Most of the time what happens is we get what's called a continuing resolution. It's just an agreement by Congress to basically keep the government running at the earlier levels. Because every year they're supposed to pass a budget, but recently they just don't. It's too hard to get everybody to agree on all the different parts. So they'll pass a continuing resolution to keep funding levels the same while they continue to try to work it out. Then they'll pass another continuing resolution, then another continuing resolution, and so on and so forth. It's not really an ideal situation, but it is more or less what we have. So we have continuing resolutions to fund most of this stuff. Additionally, what happens if they can't pass a budget and they can't pass a continuing resolution? Well, what happens if they can't pass a budget and they can't pass a continuing resolution is the government shuts down. Now, this happened, I think, twice under Trump so far. I think it also happened twice under Obama, so some of you might be familiar with it. But basically, they have rules in place that say if we can no longer fund the government, what do we do? And the rules basically say every non-essential person stops working. So, checks still go out for Social Security, military still works, police still work, but a lot of the other stuff that we expect our government to do, all those employees are just sent home. And it's really not an ideal solution to the problem. It would be much better if we had a better solution, a way to handle it, a budget every year, but it is a way to sort of handle what happens. And so you'll hear a lot about shutdowns. Now, one of the reasons we have shutdowns and we have these continuing resolutions instead of having a budget is every year Congress plays kind of a game of chicken with our budget. Now, this is one of the most important things they do. And what should happen is the budget should be the first thing they really focus on. It is on the state level, it is on your local level. But in Congress, they frequently don't get really down to the budget until kind of near the end because they want to put pressure on people. And so what happens is your congressman at the end of the session will get a 5,000-page book with 3 days to look it over before the vote, saying where all the money is going to be spent. And so it's really not a great situation we have, not a great system we have on that level. So there's definitely some room for improvement here. Oversight. Oversight is a very important function of the Congress. We talked about checks and balances. This is really one of their major checks and balances. They have the power of the purse. That's a big one. If they say we're not going to fund this, then it doesn't get funded. So if the president starts a new initiative and Congress says we won't give any money to it, we saw this with the border wall to a certain extent. What happens if Congress says we're not going to fund it? Well, the president said I'm going to steal some money from somewhere else and put it towards this, and the court said that's okay. But for the most part, if the Congress won't fund something, then the president can't do it. Also, if the Congress says this has to be funded, the president can't refuse to spend the money. That came up under President Nixon. So, Congress has a strong power of the purse. But they have other oversight functions: war powers resolutions, congressional review, confirmation, and impeachment. We're going to talk about all these very quickly. War powers resolution. Basically, Congress has the power to declare war, but the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. If the president says, go here and blow these people up, the military doesn't. So who's really in charge of war in the U.S.? The Constitution specifically gives the power to declare war to the Congress, but also says the president's in charge of the military. So how do we balance that? Well, during Nixon's presidency, Congress passed something called the War Powers Resolution Act, which basically says unless we're under attack, then the president has to get permission from Congress to leave troops in foreign countries after a certain number of days. That link on the bottom there, that's a good one. Go ahead if you want to and pause and watch it. I'd recommend it. It's a very interesting idea. But Congress basically passed the law saying, given that we're the ones that declare war, we're saying that we have the power to define when war has to be declared. And we're saying that it has to be declared if you have troops in a country for a certain number of days. Now, Nixon said, no. He said, I disagree with this law, I veto it. And Congress overrode his veto. And again, we'll talk about the specifics of that, but basically it requires a supermajority, more than 50%, 2/3, I believe, to vote in favor of overriding the president's veto. So it's a way of saying to the president, no, we're really serious about this. You have to follow these rules. And it's kind of always a black eye for the president whenever his veto is overridden, because it shows that Congress is really, really united against his position. So they passed the War Powers Resolution Act saying, President, you have to get our permission to leave troops in a country for longer than a certain amount of time. President said, no, I don't. Congress said, yes, I did. And so it became law despite the fact the president vetoed it. But that's not the end of it. Because what's interesting about the War Powers Resolution is the president says that President Nixon and every president since then have said war powers resolutions are unconstitutional. Now, it's never been challenged in a court. It's never been successfully brought to a court because the courts have said that these kind of issues are resolved between the legislative and executive branch. This really isn't what the judiciary is. We're co-equal branches. You guys figure it out. So, President says war powers resolutions are unconstitutional, so we don't have to follow them. Congress says it's the law, you have to follow them. And so what we generally see is the presidents follow the war powers resolution. However, they publicly say they don't have to follow the war powers resolution. So it's an interesting question. It is an oversight because Congress, not the president, declares war. They say they have the power to oversee the war and decide when the president has to ask their permission. The president disagrees. It's a very interesting sort of conundrum left open by the Constitution. Congressional review. So another thing that Congress gets to do is all of these executive agencies, all these things that the executive branch does, Congress gets to look at them and say, are you doing your job right? They get to call people in to testify as to how the FBI is working. How are they conducting this investigation? We saw this, the video clip there, I believe, is from Hillary Clinton's, when they were going after her, the information on her servers. And the FBI conducted an investigation. This is when Obama was the president. The FBI conducted an investigation and wasn't giving all the information immediately to Congress. Congress was very upset with that. And so this is a fun little exchange with a congressman and the head of the FBI. Actually, I believe it was the spokesman for the FBI. And this is also additionally fun because it's like his second day as the spokesman for the FBI, and he got thrown in front of Congress for a contentious hearing. And basically, he gets subpoenaed right there on the floor. He gets a legal order to turn over documents right there on the floor with the threat of being held in contempt if he doesn't. So it's a fun little dramatic video. But Congress has this power to review executive agencies' actions and the regulations executive agencies put out. Congress can say, no, that's not working, and require them to change it. So that's congressional review. Confirmation is another power for a lot of offices. So we talk about a lot of the cabinet positions, and we'll talk about those next time. The president's closest advisors, a lot of those require confirmation, and all judges require confirmation, and some other offices as well. Confirmation means that while the president gets to pick somebody, nominate them for the position, it's actually Congress that gets to determine whether or not they can have the job. And so this is just in the Senate. The president will say, I want John Smith to be the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And then it goes to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And they'll have hearings where that person appears in front of them and talks about his background, who he is, and the Senate gets to determine whether or not he's qualified enough to take that position. So the president doesn't just get to appoint his chief advisors, our people in the judiciary. The Senate, and through the Senate, the legislature has a hand in that. Now, originally, these were somewhat non-contentious. They followed something called a blue slip process for judges. Basically, because judges, district court judges, are circuit court judges, the appeals court judges, they mainly affected certain states, certain areas. For the most part, how the Congress worked is they would simply go to the senator and say, hey, who do you want? Do you want this guy? And the senator could say yes, and they called it a blue slip because it was written on a blue slip of paper. He'd say, yes, I like this guy, and then everyone would just vote in his favor. No, I don't like the guy, in which case they would not approve him, or he'd make no comment and just let people do whatever. And the whole idea was that since that directly affects that senator's district, that senator's state, I guess, more than anyone else, those senators, then it should really be up to them. That's how it used to be. Now it's become much, much more political. You saw this recently with Trump's 2 Supreme Court nominees. You saw just how political those processes got. They were played on the news, analyzed every day, trying to figure out if these people should be confirmed or not. Okay, impeachment is another power, and this again came up recently with President Trump's impeachment. So impeachment, when high executive official is guilty of treason, bribery, or another high crime or misdemeanor, and that term is not defined, the House can review the facts and vote to impeach him. Impeaching him is sort of the equivalent of bringing formal charges against somebody. When someone's impeached, it doesn't mean they're removed from office. It just means that the House has found questions serious enough to be considered for removal. So they've looked at this and they believe enough evidence exists to move forward to a trial that the president or a justice on the Supreme Court has done something important enough, that treason, bribery, other high crimes or misdemeanors, that there needs to be a trial to figure out if this person has to be removed from office. So the House votes to impeach. After the House votes to impeach, the Senate then conducts a trial. They call in witnesses, and then each senator acts as a juror, basically, and votes whether or not to remove the president from office or the Chief Justice or whoever. Now, interestingly, when the Senate conducts a trial, it is not the president of the Senate, who is the vice president of the United States, who who presides over that. Rather, it is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that's sort of to get rid of any sort of bias. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides. In our most recent case, the House voted to impeach Trump for several charges. The Senate conducted a trial and determined that they would not convict him, and so Trump was not removed. So we see Trump was impeached but not removed. Same was true of President Clinton. He was impeached but not convicted, not removed. So, it's just important to kind of keep those in mind. Most people kind of use impeachment and removal to mean the same thing. They really don't. Impeachment means that the charges were formally brought, but removal is the big step that's missing. And we'll talk more about impeachment, I believe, when we talk about the president. Okay, let's talk about our next session, how decisions are made. I think I'm just going to cut this into a short video because the other one was getting too long, and then we'll come back for how decisions are made. So let's take a break here.